Welcome back to Shovels in the Scriptures. I'm joined by Bridgett Kelly. Bridgett, thanks so much.
Yes, thank you.
If you were with us last time, we began our journey of these amazing, remarkable archaeological discoveries that have been unearthed by the shovel-wielding archaeologists in years past. And then we also unearthed a scripture that we then dare to memorize, and hence the name Shovels and the Scriptures. And for our first episode, we looked at Deuteronomy chapter 6, and that was inspired in part by the fact that we had seen that in a fishing village on the Sea of Galilee, a home that had been excavated that was clearly home to believers, because they had etched in inscriptions or graffiti into the walls of their home prayers, declarations of dependence upon Jesus. And what we want to do today is look at yet another set of archaeological discoveries and connect that back to the Scriptures. And then Bridgett again has a verse for us to dare to memorize and have on our minds and hearts as we carry on this summer. So before we move on, Bridgett, what's your favorite thing so far about Shovels in the Scriptures?
I really like learning the physical evidence that is still here from biblical times. It's really inspiring to me to think about the real people who actually lived back then and to see the way they've committed their practices to memory by leaving things behind for us, whether they intended to or not. But I think it's really cool to learn about that.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's a key take-home we really want for all of us to have, is that we're exploring not merely archaeological discoveries and not merely words in a text. We're reading, or we're learning about discoveries that were part of the lives of real people, and we're pressing into the Scriptures inspired by the living God, but written by actual people in cooperation with the Holy Spirit. The excavation tradition in archaeology goes back, of course, millennia. And one of the most amazing and really longest enduring excavation sites on the planet is in south or central Italy, on the west edge of mainland Italy, in Pompeii. And this is a photograph of an actual excavation effort, I believe in the 1970s, at Pompeii. But Pompeii has been under excavation and is still under excavation, and only around, I think, 60% of it's been excavated, because it is just massive. And the excavations at Pompeii are traced back to New Testament biblical times. There was in August, I think it was August 24th, Bridgett,
Wow.
79 AD, almost 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Incredible. Natural disaster, Mount Vesuvius erupts, huge volcano, associated earthquake damage as well, and the city of Pompeii, which was a fishing, an even bigger fishing and commercial city than what we looked at last time with Capernaum in the Sea of Galilee. This town, Pompeii, was very large and home to many people, many of them wealthy. And they were, tragically, many of them died as they were covered in the rock pieces and all the different debris that had been blown out of Mount Vesuvius with the volcano. That's the pumice, and then of course ash that you would expect to see, and maybe have seen. My brother and I were both born in Pullman, Washington, and I remember one of the earliest gifts that I was given from my parents was a little jar of ash from Mount St. Helens, which erupted, I think, in 1980.
That sounds right.
And anyways, but tragically, both at Mount St. Helens, there were people who perished, and there were many who died in 79 AD in this Roman city of Pompeii. Of course, 79 AD is very much the new Testament era. In fact, it's kind of interesting, in Acts in the New Testament, there is a particular Roman governor who appears. His name is Felix, and his wife Drusilla, actually, according to biblical historians, perishes in Pompeii.
Wow.
It's extraordinary. Real people,
Yes.
real tragedy, but maybe there's something positive that we can draw, and indeed, it's archaeological. Over really the last several centuries, and really not until about, I think, the 16th century, did excavations start in earnest at the Pompeii site, digging out all the pumice that had kind of hardened over the buildings and even the bodies, kind of frozen in time there in Pompeii. One of the discoverings was a mausoleum. How would you describe what a mausoleum is, Bridgett?
A mausoleum is kind of like a structure that houses bodies. It's sort of like a cemetery, but it's above ground. And so families would have them, and it would be a place where they could go to remember their loved ones.
And there was a wealthy, or evidently wealthy, couple with probably slaves, likely children as well, that were buried in an above-ground mausoleum. This mausoleum was obviously constructed before the volcano of 79 AD. On the side of the mausoleum are a number of carvings. So, Bridgett, what do you suppose was one of the features on the side of this mausoleum as you look at this?
It looks like a ship.
That's right. It's a ship typical of Mediterranean sea transport during the Mediterranean era, or sorry, during the New Testament era, forgive me. And why is that of relevance to us with the shovels in the scriptures?
Well, as you mentioned in Acts, this whole book of Acts is a lot about Paul and his travels, and I know that he spent a lot of time on a ship in the Mediterranean.
That's right. He was on ships many times, and it was not always a Mediterranean picnic on the sea. Lots of difficulty, lots of arduous journeys on the Mediterranean. In fact, one of those particular journeys takes place close to where you used to live, Bridgett. Tell us about Malta and where that was in reference to where you lived in Tunisia.
So Malta is an island. It's a little bit north of Tunisia, and they used to be part of the same nation. They're not anymore, but much of the culture of Tunisia is also present in Malta. And so the two countries have a strong connection through their history and culture.
And Paul comes to Malta.
Yes.
Has an interesting stay there. Actually does some miraculous healings. But then he needs to head to Rome. And what's his mode of transport going to be, Bridgett?
A ship.
That's right, a ship. And we don't know, of course, exactly. We do know that in the scriptures that Paul leaves Malta in what was called an Alexandrian ship, which would have been very typical of Mediterranean commerce and the particular technology of sails, the hull of the ship. This carving on the side of the mausoleum, according to historians, is representative of one of the kind of labor-intensive tasks manning one of these ships. It's kind of difficult to see in this carving because it's literally about 2,000 years old, but they're actually bringing the sail down. Mm-hmm. You know, you couldn't just leave the sail up when you come into port. Anyways, I'm digressing a little bit, but in Acts chapter 28, Luke, the author, provides some time-related and geographic-related details of Paul's journey from Malta ultimately to Rome. And I find it kind of cool that he stops in Sicily. I mean, I've never been to Sicily. I want to go to Sicily. We all, of course, during the pandemic, you see videos of seaside resorts and the ocean and the sun. You're like, oh, I want to go there. But Paul gets to go to Sicily. He gets to go to a particular port on the southeast corner of Sicily called Syracuse, or Siracusa, as I believe sophisticated Italian-speaking people pronounce it. After about 3 months on Malta, Paul leaves in an Alexandrian ship. A typical commercial-grade ship, that would have been used in Paul's day, perhaps similar to the one depicted in this carving in the side of the mausoleum at Pompeii. And we're told that he and his traveling colleagues stop in Syracuse. Paul leaves Malta and is going to head to the south of Italy and kind of along the southeast and eastern edge of Sicily. And a logical place to stop is the port of Syracuse, actually a really important historical port strategically for many centuries before Paul. He stays in Syracuse 3 days and then leaves again, perhaps in the same ship. They go to a Roman province or Roman city, Rhegium. And Rhegium, incidentally, I think is kind of cool, is actually modern day Reggio di Calabria, which my wife and I, we just found out that is the birthplace of Susie's great-grandfather. Isn't that crazy?
Very cool.
So what do we make of this? I mean, Bridgett and I, we love to geek out about this stuff, but there's also kind of a deeper meaning or deeper relevance, something that we can be inspired by in the fact that Paul traveled in a ship, 2,000 years ago from Malta, having multiple stops. It kind of reminds me, Bridgett, of it's almost like a metaphor for life. We're all, on a journey, stopping at different points. What comes to mind for you?
Well, I think it's also important to note that Paul, when he was on this journey, it wasn't completely his choice. He knew it was from God that he was supposed to go to Rome and speak to the emperor, but he was also in trouble with Rome, and that's why he was under arrest. And so I like to think of it that, he was on this journey much like we are on our journey of life, and sometimes what we're doing is from our own decision, and sometimes it's things that are happening to us that we can't control. But either way, we can see how God provided for them along the way and how he sustained Paul and continually spoke to him and helped him to know God was still with him. And so I think that's a really cool metaphor for how we can look at our own lives, and we're hopefully not or under arrest and taken overseas, but we do all go through struggles and problems, and God's with us as well.
Yeah, thank you for that reminder. The circumstances that Paul was under were not Mediterranean vacation-like circumstances, right? And we know that, of course, they had to spend periods of time at ports like Syracuse, kind of gauging the weather.
Yes.
What's that all about?
Well, literally what they had to do was decide whether or not it was safe to start traveling again, and especially on a boat, they would have to know long term, is it bad weather for days and days? And they talk about spending the winter there at one of the ports, but in our own life, we can stop and take note of what is going on and what's the next right move based on our current circumstances. I think that to be on a boat at night, if I was there, to me it would be very scary. You're already in the middle of the sea and you probably can't see a whole lot of what's going on around you, but especially at night where you can't be oriented north, south, east, west because you don't have the sun, and every noise could sound scary just like it does on land, except you're kind of out of your element. So I would personally find that scary.
Ironically, just as Paul would have encountered changing weather conditions, we're filming here at the back of Amanda Arnold Elementary School, and the clouds are intermittent.
Yes.
So anyways, we're having a total Mediterranean-like adventure here in the middle of Kansas with weather actively changing.
So we know a tiny bit about how Paul felt in his adventures. Psalm 37:5 says, "Commit your way to the Lord, trust in him, and he will act." And we chose this verse because this is something that Paul had to do to be able to survive and thrive on his perilous journey to Rome, especially since a lot of the circumstances were out of his control. it was essential that he committed his way to God and trusted that God was taking care of him, even though his circumstances looked like it was going to be the end several times.
Just as we need to look to God's faithfulness during the dark times, it is literally getting dark upon us intermittently. So, sorry, I just find that absolutely hilarious. So, God has a sense of humor, clearly.
He does. So we're using this verse in our own current experience, trusting God as the world is getting dark around us. So this verse is about God's faithfulness. On the screen it says His faithfulness because all verses are mostly about God. So when we say His, we know we're talking about capital H, His. And this category comes from the fact that this verse is about trusting that God will take care of us through our way through life. So then we say the reference, which is Psalm 37:5, and I write that on the back of the card. Then we say the verse, and it's commit your way to the Lord, trust in Him, and He will act. And then we say the reference again, Psalm 37:5. And that helps us connect the reference to the verse because that makes us credible as believers when we can cite where our scriptures come from in the Bible. So as we go through, we only take pieces of the scriptures at a time to help us build up. We don't try to remember the whole verse at once. This verse is a little bit shorter, so it's going to be quicker to memorize, but we still like to break it down to not overwhelm our brain. Brains cannot remember this much at once, at least not effectively. So we go through the same sequence. We start with His faithfulness, Psalm 37:5. Commit your way to the Lord, Psalm 37:5. And then we're just memorizing this verse, just this piece of it, until we've got it down. So I would keep repeating this to myself several times each day until I felt like I was confident with just this part. Once I know that I've got commit your way to the Lord, I will move on and keep adding pieces to it. So I start with His faithfulness, Psalm 37:5. Commit your way to the Lord, trust in Him, Psalm 37:5. So I added just a little bit, and I'll keep repeating just this part several times each day until I become confident with it. And this is just my recommendation of where to break apart the verse. You can do it wherever you want. I'm just doing it wherever there's a comma, but it can be whatever feels natural to you. And then we're going to add the last piece. His faithfulness, Psalm 37:5. Commit your way to the Lord, trust in Him, and He will act. Psalm 37:5. And then, of course, you just keep repeating this and keep practicing it until you are confident and have this one committed to memory. And I just also want to add that memorizing verses and repeating them to yourself is a way of practically committing your way to the Lord. When I feel nervous about something or scared or just confused, I like to repeat the verses that I know because they help me focus on God and remember that He's in control. And so that's what this verse is all about, that God's faithful to take care of us, and memorizing it helps us remember that and actually commit our way to God. So hopefully you'll experience the same thing if you decide to memorize this verse.